In this lecture, we discuss the labor supply curve and how individuals trade off the wage they get against how many hours they're willing to work. A typical measure that we use for that trade-off is the elasticity of supply. That is, the percentage change in hours worked for a percentage change in the wage. In this application, we discuss what we know about the elasticity of labor supply in reality. This is a number that has long fascinated economists because it has such important implications for the economy. As a result, there's a huge literature in economics that measures the elasticity of labor supply. The conclusions are really interesting, especially if you break it down by gender and over time. The first studies were done in the 1970s, and economists estimated the elasticity of labor supply to be around 0.2. That is, for every 10% increase in wages, people work 2% more hours. But the results were very different when they broke it down by gender. For men, the elasticity of labor supply was very small in the 1970s, close to 0. For women, it was much larger, close to 1. Why the discrepancy? Well, think about what drives the decision of how hard to work. People choose between the ability to consume more goods by making money at work or to have more leisure time instead. Now think about men in the 1970s. Remember, in the 1970s, men were expected to have a job and work full-time. 81% of working-age men in the 1970s were in the labor force. It was unusual for a man to stay at home. As a result, if a man wasn't working between 9 and 5, there wasn't a lot for him to do. Most of his friends were at their jobs, so there was no one to hang out with, and it wasn't normal for a man to do the housework. This means there weren't a lot of options besides working, so men worked. That meant there was basically zero elasticity of labor supply. For women, it was different. Only 43% of women in the 1970s were in the labor force, so they were just as likely to be in or out. They could work and bring home money for the family, or they could stay home, take leisure, or take care of the children. Since there was more choice for women, their labor supply was more elastic. Fast forward to today. What do you think has happened since the 1970s? Nowadays, it's much more common for women to work. In 2010, 62% of women were in the workforce, while the male figure dropped to 75%. Women are increasingly in a situation similar to men, where the expectation, or the family financial structure, is such that they work, and there's not as fluid a choice between working and not working. As a result, there's less substitution away from work that's realistic. How do you think this affects the elasticity of labor supply for women? The result is that compared to the 1970s, the elasticity of labor supply for women has fallen quite a bit. It's fallen from close to 1 to around 0.2. For men, it's still near 0. What we see is that we can use huge cultural shifts, like the movement of women into the labor force, to illustrate concepts from this class. As the gap between the hours that men and women work dropped, so did the gap in the elasticity of their labor supply. When we started studying labor supply, you might have thought it would be a topic about which wages and working and little else. What this application shows is the labor supply decision is also about culture and gender and how society changes over time. As women's place in society has changed, economists have noticed.